All right, the question was about contrasting sort of slow and gradual mutations as opposed to mutations that have larger effects more immediately. Oops, that's not good. And some of this gets back to that idea of evolutionary developmental biology that I was talking about, where if you have a small mutation in a section of DNA that controls when a gene gets turned on or off, especially if it's a gene that itself is controlling how other genes are activated, then that one mutation can have a significant impact on how the organism develops. And we see that there are fruit flies where a small mutation takes the antenna and turns it into a leg. Because if you go back to the early history to early insects, the insect body plan is basically a series of segments, each of which has two legs. And the head of an insect is basically a bunch of those segments all compressed together with some of those legs specialized to become mouth parts or antennae or other structures. So by changing the way that some of those control genes are expressed, you wind up reverting back to that earlier state. And instead of it being an antenna, the specialized structure, it reverts back to the more generalized leg structure. And there are similar things like that people are identifying in human development. A lot of these genes are very highly conserved. You can take some of the genes that control the development of a fly's eye and put that same gene, knock out the gene that controls the development of a mouse eye, replace it with the fly's gene, and the eyes develop normally. So there's remarkable conservation there because it's on the control level. So small changes can have big effects on that level. And, or more modest effects. You know, having a fly that has an antenna or a leg instead of an antenna, that's not necessarily something that's going to survive in the wild. But smaller changes like that it's easy to see how something like that can give you the incredible diversity that antennas have. Some antennas look like big feathers, some of them are little stubby things. There are all sorts of different ways that they work, and small changes in that regulatory process can have big impacts on the structure of the organism in the end.
You're nice to say that they try to religion, but basically it's fundamentalist Christians that are doing this. Now, there's no real, nothing like that in Islam religion. There's no groups like that doing that. And since my opinion is America is more fundamentalist Christian than anywhere else, has there been any surveys to show where there's more fundamentalist Christians, there's more creationism trying to do this? Like in Europe, they seem to be more secular, so there's less of that going on. Is that just anecdotal, or has there been any research about it?
The question is about pointing out correctly that when I was talking about that this is a religious idea, that it's a narrow sectarian religious idea really from Christian fundamentalism. Creationism, as we understand it, you really start seeing in the early 19-teens. So it's less than 100 years old that creationism, as we think of it, really exists at all. There are Islamic forms of creationism. It shows up even in Orthodox Jewish communities in some cases, but not in the same sort of it must be in the schools sort of way. And the question was also about, are there cross-cultural studies? Are there studies of Europe? There have certainly been studies of fundamentalism in Europe, and in Europe and in South America and a lot of places, American evangelicals have gone over and are producing fundamentalist communities, or at least fundamentalist churches in Europe and elsewhere, which changes that dynamic. There's a lot of activism in England and in Ireland, largely as a result of that same sort of, because of American missionaries essentially going over and stirring up creationist sentiment. And I don't know of as much that's been systematically studied in South America, but certainly anecdotally, similar things are happening there. Area that is historically very Catholic, and the Catholic Church has been quite sympathetic to evolution as a science. There's been a rising evangelical and especially Pentecostalist and fundamentalist branch of evangelicalism that's rising, especially in younger populations in South America. So I don't know of surveys of how evolution is being taught in South America to know what effects that's happening, but I would be surprised if it's not having some effect at least. And in Turkey, they have a national science curriculum. So when the Islamist parties gain power, if they're in the coalition and they get the Ministry of Education, evolution comes out of the science textbooks. They publish the textbooks every year on sort of on newspaper stock, so they can pulp them every year. So every year, when the Islamists are in the coalition, evolution is out. When the secularists are back in power, evolution is back in. And it's just a seesaw that goes on. I'm sorry. The question was that all this talk about Texas, the University of Texas in Austin and the public universities in Texas are quite good, and there are a lot of great evolutionary biologists at those universities. So what's the atmosphere there? What's going on with Texas?
And do they teach real science? I mean,
At the university level, absolutely. And the same thing happened in Kansas, where there are incredible evolutionary biologists at the universities in Kansas, but there's a disconnect between, when I was there, I was at the Natural History Museum. People come from all over the world to study the specimens that we have there, to look at the evolutionary history of those species. Because you measure you take measurements of the skulls, you do this, you do that. That's how you do the evolutionary research. So people were coming from all over, but you get a few blocks away from the campus and people think it's all a giant hoax, right? And so there's some fundamental disconnect between how scientists practice what we do and how the public understands what science is, really in broad general terms. Like, what is it that a scientist's day job consists of, right? A lot of people think that university professors are there to teach classes, which is part of the job, but most of what they're spending their time on is not classroom work, it's research. And publishing and grantsmanship and all of that, which is an important part of that, but there's not necessarily the public appreciation of what that process is and what the results of that scientific research are. So in Texas, a lot of the professors were actively involved. One of the statements that I came with to the standards was signed by the Texas Academy of, I'm going to get this wrong, TAMIST is the acronym, and it consists of the members of the National Academy of Science, Nobel Prize winners, National Academy of Engineering, Institute of Medicine, Texan citizens who are members of those elite scientific bodies. And they sent a strong statement saying, look, you've got to do this right. There were David Hillis, who's at UT Austin, was one of the experts who testified to the board, really trying to get them not to adopt bad science standards. And in the year that happened, he and the other 3 scientists who did that got the Friends of Darwin Award that NCSE gives to evolution defenders around the country. So yeah, I mean, there were active people on the ground, and there still are. There are groups like Texas Freedom Network that does a lot of on-the-ground organizing, as well as there were grassroots petitions and other things that the science community in Texas was organizing. So yeah, it's the culture war. It's 2 warring sides. Yeah, the question was about the germ theory and why we're not teaching that as a theory rather than as a fact. And isn't that fertile ground for either Christian Science advocates or alternative medicine advocates to say, let's teach all the sides of the issue and just get it out there. I haven't seen them trying it, but I'm surprised not to have seen it. So the question is, a lot of what I talked about here were big statewide things that got a lot of media coverage and a lot of big public activism. But most of what we deal with, as I said, is an individual teacher who calls up and says, I've got a parent asking me to do this, or my principal is asking me to do this that I don't want to do, or a parent saying, why is my kid coming home with creationist material? And what do we do about that? And that's the bread and butter of what we do at NCSE. It's most of the calls that we get never get into the paper, it never comes to a court case, and it would be a bad outcome if it did come to a court case. That's not the ideal outcome, because court cases are divisive and they're unpleasant and they're nasty and they divide people. In a case like Dover, the community was already so divided by the time that came to court that it was actually cathartic for them to just get it out in the open and have a judge say, you're right, you're wrong, let's move on. But for the most part, what we do is we talk to those parents and say, okay, here's, a lot of it is hand-holding and saying, what you want to do, you want to say, you want to write a letter to the teacher and express your concern. I'll look that over for you. But usually the letter's pretty good. By the time they get to us, they've probably been doing a fair amount of research already. They're pretty squared away to begin with, and they just need someone to say, yes, you're doing the right thing. You're not alone. Because a lot of them feel like they are. They're often coming into this conflict because maybe they go to a different church than the rest of the people in the community. And so they're feeling a little bit ostracized already. or they don't go to church at all and they're feeling ostracized. Or there's some other issue that has divided folks that divided them against others, and they're feeling like they don't want to push this issue forward because it'll just further alienate them. And they need someone to say, look, you're doing the right thing for yourself, for your kids, for your community. And we can connect them, if we have other members in the area, we can connect them with them so that they have a support network, connect them with local universities, other resources that can be helpful to them as they work through the bureaucracy and try to come up with some satisfactory resolution. And usually we do. Usually, somehow or other, we're able to find something that the parent comes out of it feeling satisfied and the teacher comes out feeling satisfied and evolution is still being taught. So the issue is the politicization of a lot of these issues, that they become not just partisan in sectarian in religious terms, but partisan in political terms. That Republicans are much more likely to reject evolution than Democrats, much more likely especially to reject global warming than Democrats, and that having a scientific issue, a scientific fact, become an issue of political debate, where every Republican candidate for the Senate last year rejected the scientific consensus around global warming, about whether it's happening and what its causes are. I mean, that's a remarkable problem, and it's something where the Republican Attorney General in Virginia is holding essentially an inquisition into a former faculty member at the University of Virginia. He's now in Pennsylvania, but he used to be at Virginia, and he's now trying to get all of the old emails and all of the documents that this guy generated when he was in Virginia. Courts have thrown this out so far, but there's nothing to say that Congress can't issue subpoenas and do the same thing. So the politicization of the basic science, of just whether evolution is true, whether global warming is happening, and whether humans are causing it, is a problem. It's one thing to say we don't like the policy proposals that people are putting forward. We want to see we don't like cap and trade, we like this instead, or we don't think anything should be done. That's a policy decision that someone can make, but to say we're not going to do anything because we don't think that the science is there when it is, that's a real problem, because the political process is not where we resolve scientific issues, and it shouldn't be. And the Catholic Church's position on evolution. The Catholic Church we think of it as this very hierarchical thing, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. So right now, the incoming bishop in the Santa Rosa diocese is a guy who's been in the area around Bend, Oregon for a long time, and is a young earth creationist. So that's going to be interesting for the folks in the Santa Rosa area. But the Pope, several popes have made statements that are supportive of evolution. Pope John Paul II said that evolution had to be regarded as more than a hypothesis. That, barring some objections that someone could make about the origin of the soul and these sorts of metaphysical issues, that the idea that humans evolved is not, that they were not prepared to say that it was incompatible with Catholic theology. I think the Catholic Church learned at least some of its lesson from the Galileo affair, and doesn't want to try to set itself in opposition to the science. On metaphysical issues about the soul and these sorts of things, that's where the sticking point is around evolution for them. And there are a variety of approaches within the church to those sorts of questions. And to the issue of the schools that you raised, that rhetoric. I mean, I think that I think you're right that in the 60s and the 50s during the civil rights movement, as integration was coming, there was a lot more push for local control. But the rhetoric of William Jennings Bryan during the Scopes trial, what he was arguing for was that people should be able to control, that voters should be able to control what's taught in their schools. They paid the taxes, they should be able to control what's taught. That was his rhetoric, that was his argument. Bryan was not really a fundamentalist. He wasn't aligned theologically with the fundamentalists of the day. He was a progressive, and he was a majoritarian. So he wanted to see, that was the democratic impulse that he was drawing on. But that same rhetoric, the idea that, we pay our taxes, or students should be able to make up their own mind, right? That's the same critical analysis language. It's that the origin, a lot of that euphemistic fairness language. And the interesting thing, I did a study where I was looking at the rhetoric in Harun Yahya's writings, which are largely just sort of a telephone game of American creationist writings that are translated into Turkish, edited a little bit, translated back into English, and looking for that same rhetoric that's one of the pillars of American creationism. I mean, it's going back to Brian, you always see that. It's an important part of the style of argument. It doesn't show up in Hari Yahya's writings. It gets dropped. That sort of liberal, democratic ideal as a style of the argument. He's just saying evolution is wrong, so it should be forbidden. It's wrong, so leave it out of the classrooms. That's not the way that American creationists argue it. So you do see cultural shifts as creationism moves around the world. But again, Hari Yahya is drawing so heavily on American sources that it's hard necessarily to know how to interpret that. Creationism in Saudi Arabia, say, is of a different nature also. So sort of authentically, Islamic creationism is going to be more different than Hari Yahya is from American creationism. Essentially, what is to be done? Is that about this and about global warming and how do we deal with this? Is anything to be done? I think so. I think that one of the things that I'm most encouraged to see in recent years as I travel around on college campuses and talk to grad students, that there's more of a sense from professional scientists that they need to do more to engage the public. And I think that bridging that gap, getting it so that so that folks in the community who are not specialists, who are not professional scientists, understand what science is and why evolution education is important, is really important. So yesterday, some friends of mine were doing from the National Center for Evolutionary Synthesis, which is a center, it's an NSF-funded center at Duke University and UNC, both. They have a bunch of postdocs that they have doing evolutionary research, and they organized something where they sent them out to local high schools around the country. So some of them were in Iowa, some of them were in Nebraska, Montana, Virginia, where they were going to these schools and talking about their research. And I don't know if, and you know, this is the new program that they're trying out for the first time this year. It sounds like it went well for them. And things like that have a lot of potential to break down some of the barriers that people have, that they think evolution is something really scary and that that it has all these grand metaphysical implications. You meet an evolutionary biologist and that's not what they're doing. They're not doing this, you know, oh, what does it mean to be human if we evolved from a common ancestor with other primates? That's not what biologists are talking about. And so a lot of times, if you can just get the ears out of get the fingers out of the ears, get around whatever the religious objection or political objection or whatever it is, and get someone to say, to just listen to, okay, what is evolutionary biology? What is it that we do? What are we talking about here? They'll suddenly say, oh, that's okay. I don't mind you teaching that. So it's sort of a retail politics of it that we're doing at this point. Traditional things like NOVA programs tend to be preaching to the converted, but there are groups that are doing science cafes around the country where you bring a scientist out to a bar and stand them up after a game and say, you know what, I study sports physiology, so you just watch the basketball game. Let's talk about what do we know about how knees work. And it's working, and it engages people who might not otherwise think of themselves as interested in science, and it says, actually, this is interested. So finding those sorts of things, I think there's huge opportunities there.
Let's thank Josh again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all.